Assalamu alaikum. Once again, I welcome you all in my YouTube channel English Language and Literature. If you are new on my channel, then kindly subscribe it and press the bell icon for the notification. Let's go to start the topic. Today we are going to study poetry and types of poetry. As earlier I have told you that poetry is a language written with rhythm, figurative language, imagery, sound devices, and emotionally charged language. Poetry is a medium through which poets express his emotions, feelings, and thoughts with musical tone. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of feelings, and it is also the beauty of language. Poetry is often considered the oldest form of literature. Before writing was invented, oral stories were commonly put into some sort of poetic form to make them easier to remember and recite. Poetry today is usually written down but is still sometimes performed. A lot of people think of rhymes and counting syllables and lines when they think of poetry, and some poems certainly follow strict forms. But other types of poetry are so free form that they lack any rhymes or common patterns. There are even kinds of poetry that cross genres or lines, such as prose poetry. In general, though a text is a form when it has some sort of meter or rhythm, and when it focuses on the way the syllables, words, and phrases sound when put together, and poems are heavy in imagery and metaphor, and one often made up of fragments and phrases rather rather than complete grammatical correct sentences. And poetry is nearly always written in stanzas and lines, creating a unique look on the page that poetry has experienced in the classroom is usually one of three types. There are the shorter, more modern poems, spanning anything from a few lines to a few pages. Often these are collected in books of poems by a single author or by a variety of writers. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is one of the most commonly taught poems of this type. Then there are classical formulaic poems of Shakespeare's time, for example, blank verse and the sonnet. And finally, there are the ancient epic poems transcribed from oral stories. These long, complex poems resemble novels such as Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Now comes towards the types of poetry. According to Percy Shelley, poetry is the expression of the imagination. It is a musical composition in which a poet expresses his thoughts and emotions. Poetry, for our convenience, is broadly divided into two types, or we can also set categories. Number one is subjective poetry, and number second is objective poetry. Subjective poetry. The subjective poetry deals with the poet's own thoughts and emotions. It deals with what the personally poet thinks and feels within. The subjective poetry is highly personal. It appeals more our hearts. We generally try to gather some information about the poet through his work of art. The subjective matter of the subjective poetry is closely connected with the poet, for it deals with his own thoughts and feelings. But it becomes very difficult for the reader to take his work as subjective and objective. The lyrical elegy, sonnet, and ode are poetical forms of subjective poetry, as William Wordsworth's Trenton Abbey and Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. These are the fine examples of subjective poetry. Now comes towards objective poetry. Objective poetry is the record of the poet's keen observations and experiences about the things he sees around him. He does not invest his own thoughts, feelings, and emotions while describing the memorable deeds, events, etc., and many other things also. To the work of art, the poet treats the subjective objectively and disappointmently and handles the subject matter maintaining complete detachment. He values his experience of his eye and ear rather than experience of his heart and mind. Objective poetry is older than subjective, and fine example of objective poetry can be a collection of ballads, folk poetry, historical songs, and metrical romances called relics of ancient English poetry. They were published in 1765 by Thomas Percy. The ballad and the epic are forms of objective poetry. आसान लफ्ज़ों में हम पोइट्री के टाइप्स को ऐसे भी डिफ़ाइन कर सकते हैं। सब्जेक्टिव पोइट्री जो है वो उसमें राइटर्स डील करता है अपनी फीलिंग्स इमोशंस से, जो उसके ख़यालात होते हैं पर्सनली, वो जो फील करता है वो सब्जेक्टिव पोइट्री में लिखता है, उसको हम सब्जेक्टिव पोइट्री कहते हैं। उसके बाद जो ऑब्जेक्टिव पोइट्री है उसमें राइटर जो ऑब्जर्वेशन करता है, एक्सपीरियंसेस जो उसके, वो अपने माहौल के इर्द गिर्द जो ऑब्जर्वेशन करता है, दूसरों के ख़यालात को समझता है, उनकी फीलिंग्स को समझ के अपनी पोइट्री में यूज़ करके लिखता है, उसको हम ऑब्जेक्टिव पोइट्री कहते हैं। सो गाइस, हमारा लेक्चर यहाँ पे एंड हुआ। मिलते हैं नेक्स्ट लेक्चर में। हमारा नेक्स्ट लेक्चर होगा फॉर्म्स ऑफ पोइट्री एंड एलिमेंट्स ऑफ पोइट्री।